So we're gonna get started. We're gonna change up our workshop meeting schedule a little bit. We're waiting on Brad Lindell from C to get on board, but in the meantime, while we're waiting for him, we're gonna start with the budget presentation and discussion. So Amy and Mr. Helgerson, we'll turn it over to you.
All right. Amy, do you want to? So if you pull up the, do you want to go through the executive summary? Okay.
Actually, if you want to, I'll go through the executive summary if you want to fill in that.
I can't pull it up on there because they need to be able to connect.
We can go through whatever you want. They should be able to do that.
Yep.
So I don't know if Tom is on already. He was between negotiations and home. Connie and Sandy and Tom, you'll have to pull it up on board book.
Tom's here.
Oh, there's coming.
I got it up.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm just going to summarize everything. So I have sheets for every, as you all know, I have sheets for every fund. So we're going to start with the general fund. So I recalculated the revenue and I brought the ADMs down to 1,887. So that makes up our K-12 students, 25 ECSE students, and 15 tuition in students.
What did you bring it down to, Amy? I'm sorry.
1887. I had, on the original revised budget, I put it at 1,900, but we dropped 12 students from March to April. So doing that adjustment brought the state sources revenue down by 59,588.
Thanks, Hope. And also last month, we brought in our Fund 9 into the general fund, another GASB 84 thing that we had to do. So that brought our revenue up by 143,000. But it's in a restricted revenue, but it's shown in that $21,004,291 number. Due to all of the changes that have occurred with COVID, we brought our purchase services decreased by about $93,000. The district saved these dollars by not having to pay sub-teachers and paras. And also we did save some money on transportation costs. We only have, right now we are only paying Benjamin Bus per the MDE. We're paying him for our regular transportation routes and the special ed and homeless routes that they would normally have. Everything else is done. And I think we have like 2 months to pay him yet for the special ed route, which will get paid this month. I brought the capital expenditures increased with the revised budget by $33,000. That is because we're doing the LED lighting project. And when we did the adopted budget, that wasn't even thought of. And then when Tim and I did the revised budget, the true numbers weren't there. And there were some extra added costs to that. But we should, again, see those savings in the electrical and the utility bills at the end of this month. So again, these are just estimates. So I'm projecting an unassigned fund balance to be about $1,774,000. Again, it is just a guesstimate. A lot of this is our one-time non-spendables, which is a lot. Right now I have it at $46,000. What non-spendables are, it's money it's cash that went out of the bank this year, but we're actually going to use it for next year. Like before they canceled spring sports, a lot of those coaches had bought their supplies and stuff, so we're just going to push that back to next year, and then they won't have a budget for next year. Things like that. So then what I also did, I separated. You still have to board approve the student activities, but that's going to be on the next page. It's just easier for everybody to read that way. So the total revenues in student activities are about $180,000, and we're going to have expenditures of about $158,000. A lot of the expenditures are right now because we have to give the music trip refunds. So we'll probably have a budget overall fund balance of about $106,000, and that makes up all of the student activities that are in there. There's music activity, Spanish activity, speech activity, and there's just a couple other ones that are on there. But like Spanish activity is pretty high right now because they're saving money for their trip. They've started to pay for that for next year. So then we're going to go to food service. So I'm predicting a negative food service ending balance of about $27,000. Even though staff are preparing an estimated 1,000 meals per day, the new projected revenue will still be down from last year. I did a comparison revenue brought in from purchased meals from 2019 to 2020, and just in that 3 months, it's about $100,000 less than what we normally would have predicted. So that accounts for a lot of the negative fund balance. The projected expenses in the food service fund are projected to be less. This is because not as much food and supplies are being purchased during this time, but we are still having to pay all of our staff. So then we're going to go to community ed, and as we all know, community ed was impacted the most by the COVID pandemic. The revenues are about an estimated $348,000 lower than what was projected in the revised budget from February. The loss due is because we have to offer free childcare. We're not getting any income, and we're not being able to have any classes, so we're not having any fees brought in, and the circuit's closed. So it's a major loss in revenue. And even though the expenses were decreased, community education will operate in a deficit this year by about $180,000. I have projected that as a whole, it will be in a negative fund balance. As a whole, the community ed will have a positive fund balance, but the restricted balance for community ed will be in a negative. So if you look on the sheets, the reserve for community education will be about $160,000 negative. The reserve for ECFE will be about $54,000 to the good, and school readiness will also have a positive fund balance of $185,000. Fund 7, our debt service, that remains to be the same pretty much the same as it was in the revised budget. I did change our dental. We do a dental self-insured program, and because a lot of people were not able to go to the dentist office, but they're still paying their premiums, so I predict to have about a $38,000 fund balance in that account. And the construction fund is only made up of the COP dollars, which we could spend by the end of the year just transferring some money for expenses that were made and paid out of the general fund.
Do we have any concern about that self-insured fund, that we see a surge in that in the coming months? That's one of the things that we've been struggling with is we're self-insured for medical, and we went from, well, we're down probably 90% on claims, but what we're really apprehensive about is what that tail is going to look like after, once people are able to get in and do things that were deferred.
And also, has anybody asked for a rebate on their premiums since they weren't able to use it?
No. Not to the best of my knowledge, no. I haven't heard any complaints about the dental. I know, most dentist offices are open now. I assume there will be a surge in claims, but I think we have a pretty healthy fund balance to help that.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
this is Connie. Could you tell me were the kids on the band trip, were they 100% refunded?
They were only refunded the amount that they had to pay in. If they did fundraising, I believe the fundraising dollars stayed in the account. If they had to pay for the fee, or if they chose not to do fundraising and paid that fee, that money was refunded. Hope, is that correct?
Almost all of it.
Was refunded? Okay.
I wouldn't say all of it, but it was close.
Yeah.
It's the out-of-pocket expense,
Yes.
which honestly, we're lucky to get that because they didn't have to do that. I mean, there was a pretty clear disclaimer that said that it was at their own risk. They didn't buy the insurance. They could have bought the insurance. So if they didn't buy the insurance, it was completely at their own risk. Now, obviously, I think a global pandemic certainly helped their case here. So we're thankful to get what we got.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
This is Sandy.
Yep.
I was under the impression that we got 80%. That was what I thought was in the email that we were told. So, I'm very happy with that. Don't get me wrong. I thought that was what we were told. I could be wrong.
Is that about right?
Logan actually did a lot of the work to process the refunds. He just gave us the data and that's how we processed the refunds.
Okay.
Our office really didn't do any work with it. It was mainly Logan.
Great.
I don't know. I don't know how much was originally paid in. I know I made the calls to the tour company, you know, initially, but that was about my role in it. And then, you know, Logan passed the information along, like Amy said, so.
And the only time that I had questioned him was if they did the fundraising dollars, which was, that pretty much stayed in the music activity. It was their out-of-pocket expense that were refunded.
And again, I'm very grateful to get all that back. I was just answering Connie's question, and I just looked up the letter, and he said we were receiving up to 80% of what we paid in.
Good, thanks for the clarification, Sandy. So the fundraising dollars then, like for the seniors that are graduating, can they designate where they're, who they want their fundraising dollars to go to, or is it just a big pool? Is that a Logan question?
I would say that's a Logan question,
Okay.
or it just, if it's fundraising dollars, I would say it would just stay in the pool.
Okay, okay. Okay. Do you have more, Amy?
I do not have any more, but you will need to approve it at some point.
At the June
At the June meeting?
June 8th
Okay.
meeting.
Okay,
You
and
think there'll be
that,
changes before then?
I'm hoping not.
Okay.
And that is also when I'll bring the adopted budget forward.
The adopted budget for
2021. Mhm.
Okay.
Yep.
Which honestly, that's,
It's gonna be a crapshoot.
how do you do it?
Excuse my language.
Yeah. I've had a lot of, I've been in a lot of discussions on how other school districts are doing it, so.
So
I mean-
We'll see.
question around the community education budget piece, and maybe this is Stephen or maybe this is you, Amy, but just in terms of, as we're looking at the summer and then potentially going into the fall and ECFE membership and the use of this facility, what's our thoughts kind of related to that and how this might impact to the positive or negative, the deficit that we currently have?
Well, we understand that we're gonna be able to operate our summer kids company. I mean, we're planning to move forward with that. So that'll help us. I mean,
And that's reflected.
That is reflected,
Okay.
yes.
But,
So if all of a sudden they pull that back, then obviously that has an impact.
you know, how many summer camps we're able to run, which we're ramping up to run them, you know, with MDH guidelines in place. Whatever the date is, June 8th, June 15th, I think is this, when we're able to start, but they'll be done with a smaller capacity. Max is something that we're looking at. I know that the instructors have tried to build some parameters. That's a little tougher with weight training and your touching equipment, but I know that they're working on, they have parameters built so that if we're given the go ahead to be able to run that, we're ready to go. Stephen Jensen and his staff have, you know, separated the community ed center equipment out, so you have it's separated between aerobics and weights. So when we're given the thumbs up there, we're gonna get back going there too. And the question is, do you charge a full membership price?
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
If all the amenities aren't necessarily available? So that'll be another, you know, hurdle. We have groups that continuously are contacting us about renting field space. That's another tough question. Do you allow groups to come into the buildings? Or do you just do strictly outdoor rental with some pretty strict parameters in place and maybe a deposit fee? Because you have to rely on people to follow social distancing guidelines and follow,
Right.
they're gonna get here, you know, association, here are the rules that you need to follow. Well, then it's up to them to follow them. There's gonna be nobody necessarily policing them. So one of the ideas that we've discussed or thrown out is when you book that facility, you put a deposit down, essentially as a carrot, saying, I'm gonna follow these guidelines. And if we get no complaints, you're gonna get the deposit back. I mean, that's honestly what we've talked about, to
Right.
try to hold people accountable for following the guidelines.
Well, to some degree, if there was an incident, they should have, insurance liability,
Yep.
but of
Yeah.
course, we're still exposed to some degree.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
So additional insured, which we have that programming and set up in place with, through MSBA and through, it's on our facility rental, so we just require anybody that rents, whether an outdoor or indoor facility, they go on and it's required that they have to do it. So I think there'll have to be some amendments to the facility use policy before we're ready to go. So that also could potentially be coming on June 8th.
So some of those rentals, have we had that baked into this budget, or would that be an add-on if we decided to go that direction?
The rentals would be an add-on.
Okay.
The kids' company for summer school, or for the month of June, is in the budget. It's actually, I think Jen at one point said she had like 90 students
Oh.
registered for
That's great.
each day.
Will they be able to run at full capacity?
We'd have to probably split the kids up.
But I think that they're planning on
Steven's on. Did you want to say something, Steven?
Yeah, so Jenna sent out numbers last week, and we have 90 registered with about between, Fridays are light, but somewhere around in the 30s to low 40s per day. So, we'll staff accordingly to make sure that, we're in line with everything, as well as trying to, compensate for summer care. But we won't see 90 per day.
No. So we've had families that, their jobs, they're furloughed or whatever for June, but they'll be back in July. And a lot of families, because we can't do the field trips, that they backed out because that was kind of the only thing they were signing up for. So we may see bigger numbers in July or August if some of that can begin. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Thanks,
And to
Jenna.
go back a little bit on the facilities piece, I'm in a meeting weekly with other facility directors across the state on what they're doing. There are some that aren't allowing any outside people anywhere on their grounds at all this summer. There are some that are starting in July. There are some that are starting next week. But I think we need to make sure that we have a plan in place. We already currently make sure that all renters have a liability insurance piece in place. But we have a joint powers meeting tomorrow night, which we'll be talking about some of this. And then as far as enrichment and youth camps and everything, there's a youth sports guidelines that went out via the governor last week. That outlines how many people you can have in certain spaces, and basically ratios in which those camps can happen. We've had a meeting with the varsity coaches and shared that information, and then they are working on plans to see if they can actually run their camp within that. Some have asked to reschedule. Andy and I are working with those coaches to see if it's possible to reschedule without competing with the other sports.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think, kind of just in looking at the budget, that this is obviously the biggest deficit that we have, and so any creative ways that we can take to close that delta. But then obviously doing it within the guidelines is probably gonna be imperative.
Right.
Obviously, we've cut $750,000 out of our budget. So, that'll be reflected in the adopted to hopefully correct some of that downward turn in our unassigned fund balance.
Are you hearing any more about a shift from your cohorts?
No, our I was kind of happy this week because our property tax payments came in and they're at 98%,
Oh, wow.
which
That's
was
great
better than
news.
what so we won't have to cash borrow yet.
Great, that's great
Yep.
news. Good.
I think it's just like any industry, it's all dependent on how fast we get up and running again. You know, we've been able to stop the bleeding for the short term, but now we need to kick in the next wave of contingency plans, which, you know, we met and talked about some of them today, which I don't feel comfortable talking about over the air, but, you know, it'll all be dependent on how many kids show up next fall. And I think everybody, not just our district, everybody should be concerned about that. So, I will tell you this, and I will say this, you know, our district, I think, has done a great job during this distance learning plan of having things in place. I basically authorized today to go ahead and purchase devices for K2. To get that, we have to do it now. We don't have time to wait and figure out how we're gonna get the money. We have to do it. My hope is, based off of what I've read from the legislation that was just passed, that we'll be able to use some of that long-term facility maintenance dollars, the restricted account, to transfer to pay for. So that's one of the smart reasons why we held back a whole bunch of dollars out of the LTFM spending. And the other possibility is using that CARES money to help purchase those devices, the federal grant, which devices for kids are an eligible expense. We don't know how much we're gonna receive yet and what that process looks like. But again, we don't have time. I know Stephen had made a call today. As soon as I said, thumbs up, I think you need to do it. He made a call with a supplier and he said that we'll get them mid-July if we ordered this week. But he said if it was another model, we're looking at October. So I think that's smart. We don't know what that's gonna look like, whether there would be some sort of hybrid distance learning model in place. But I will say this, our district is a nice size that we can respond to our families' needs. We know that it's really important to get our elementary kids here. And I think the framework that we discussed today gets our elementary kids here every single day. You know, secondary, maybe not, depending on what we're required to do from the Department of Health and CDC. But it puts a hybrid model in place for our secondary and gets our kids from our elementary here every single day. And I don't know that that's gonna be possible in some larger districts, so I think there's some really good pieces that can come out of this for us, if we're able to just weather this a little bit. I think that could be a big advantage for our district.
I was gonna say, if we come up with a good plan and market it, we may be attractive to other districts,
Yep.
other kids from other districts.
So obviously there's optimal, everybody's back, that's plan A, right? Plan B is some sort of hybrid model, which, you know, gets our youngest learners here every day or as much as possible, and does a hybrid distance learning, not this spring's distance learning, but a new type of distance learning with kids also coming into school, you know, at our secondary levels. And when I say secondary, I'm thinking and this is just brainstorming, maybe 7-12. And then option C is if we're not allowed to occupy buildings at all, then that's distance learning. But distance learning next fall needs to look different than it did this spring. Even though I think we did a good job, it just needs to look different. So those are the three options, and the other option, or the other thing that I think our district really can take advantage of and just quickly move through this, is get an online school up and running. Like an in-house Jordan School District sponsored online program. K-12.
I mean, there are some kids that reacted well to that and are good learners that way, but we also need to really protect those kids that the online piece was not good for them, so, yeah.
The
And
problem,
I know you're aware of that.
yeah, the problem is there'll be families, I know this to be true. There'll be families that have a child that's immunocompromised, and they may have 2 or 3 other kids. Well, if they've got 4 kids in their household, that's $28,000 that's not coming into school. So they're going to find an online option. That's, obviously, I'm talking about a particular what-if scenario. They're going to find an online option. Do you want them coming to Jordan or going somewhere else? So I just think the more models that can be in place, the more creative thinking in terms of programming that can be put in place right away and advertised, like you said, Deb, I think almost marketed this summer, the better off the district will be.
Would we, in that scenario, Matt, because I know the funding piece is gonna be important, if we were to create kind of a consortium type of online kind of environment where we kind of partner with other kind of districts, because I'm sure that others are thinking about this quite a bit.
Yeah.
But doing it in a way where you could still tag a child to a particular district so that you're not necessarily losing out on that funding, is there a way legislatively to be able to do that? Or do we have to have our own in-house online learning to be able to get those dollars counted for our district?
That's a good question.
That is a really good question. I think it's a good idea. I mean, right now, you can buy, like, there are districts that there's online solutions and you can buy their curriculum, and you can buy their product, but then you keep, the kids stay with you, but you're paying like a per student registration cost for that online program. You're not optimizing your dollars that way. I mean, Mars-wise hope, I mean, there's probably not today a way to do that, but that's something that the state's probably gonna have to think more creatively about. That worries me, to be honest with you, the state thinking creatively about something like that.
I think there are some districts that have it, so I could reach out to them.
There are, I mean, you look at Houston Public Schools, they have an online version, and it's very successful, and it's statewide programming. I just think that, you know, going back to my comment earlier about some staff not wanting to come to work because of being immunocompromised or whatever, you could say those are the staff that get priority for being a part of the online portion of our district. I mean, there's a lot of logistics to work out, but I think what we did today is sort of develop those concepts, and now it just needs to be flushed out, very clear details on each one. And the advantage our district has over a larger district is we can do it fairly quickly and pretty nimbly. I know that the principals are going to have conversations with their staff over the next week about this concept and start getting their feedback, just to poke holes in some things as well.
So Rob, your rationale for the consortium piece, is that so that you can tap into the
Economy of scale.
expertise of, like, say, a science teacher in Belle Plaine and a social
Right.
studies teacher?
It makes a lot of sense.
So you have economies of scale potentially, you have access to expertise that you wouldn't necessarily have here.
Gotcha.
You have a wider net, but in order to do that, you would probably have to pay a small percentage of those dollars that would ultimately come to us in terms of kind of a membership fee.
Sure.
But it's also, I think it's a way to play offense because you're creating something kind of unique and valuable. You're also playing a little bit of defense because I think that it's not even just going to be families that have kids that, kind of have a respiratory or some kind of condition that they don't want their kids to come back here. I think that there's going to be a tremendous amount of fear too, and just people of not, are a little bit, not exactly kind of sure. And so I think that if we can create as many options as possible within kind of that, I'm guessing at the end of the day, it'll end up being a hybrid, to just be able to say, we're going to be as flexible as possible. We're going to meet your child and your family in terms of kind of where you are. And I think that that's the compelling sell, because I think that what I am hearing at least is a lot of families that are a couple of things. One, there's a little bit of kind of fear, and so now all of a sudden you're kind of looking to see kind of what other options are out there. And then just in terms of, you know, kind of some of the uncertainty that's out there, that now all of a sudden, you know, they're looking at options that they didn't necessarily otherwise, and I think we've got to address that head on.
I think the
So if we want to be the impetus in this and be the leader, I'm wondering if rather than the consortium idea, if we would be the main hub that would hold the contract and we would subcontract for specialists in other districts to encourage, because I'm afraid if we do the consortium, then what, the kids from Belle Plaine are gonna say, oh, I can do this and just stay in Belle Plaine.
Oh, yeah, well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think that if we were to go down that path,
Yeah.
we would want to take a lead position to say,
Right.
we're trying to kind of do this to make sense for our district. If this aligns with the vision that you have, come on board and we'll figure out how to make that work in
Right.
maybe another place.
Uh-huh.
But I don't think that we take a back seat and let somebody else
Right.
drive it.
Kind of like the soccer program.
Yeah, we drive it.
Well, the other option too is work with the teachers union and develop a new model where you have, I don't know what the number is. Let's say you have 100 kids that want to be online at our high school, 912. You might have one social studies teacher that teaches those 100 kids and gets paid a stipend that doesn't exist in the contract right now because it's a completely different model. I mean, that's something that, or it's part of their assignment, and you say, you know, you're gonna teach these 100 kids, you're gonna get paid for 2 class periods or whatever it is, plus a prep for teaching those 100 kids. Because you're going to potentially, again, nothing's set in stone, but a hybrid model, not every kid is gonna be there each day. So you're gonna have, I mean, you're not gonna have a full load. So I think it's doable in-house with a limited set of offerings, course offerings. If you wanted to expand it and have it written, then I think your idea is, I think it's a really good idea. I mean, you think about the Southwest Metro schools.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking.
You could almost develop a massive consortium, and maybe Southwest Metro is the sponsor. I mean, they are now, they have an online program right now. We don't like to send our kids because we pay a fee.
Right.
So this is trying to get as much done in-house as possible. I think there's some opportunity here, but again, it's gonna require a whole bunch of people thinking outside the box.
Right. And it's gonna require that we're gonna have to maintain the reimbursement. I mean, it's.
Exactly.
The same as in healthcare right now. I mean, there's this big, you know, kind of push to telemedicine or telehealth or video visit. The care model has been there for 10 years. The only reason why it hasn't been as pronounced as it is now is because you don't get the reimbursement. If you go to the physician in the physician office, you get a higher fee than if you got it from a virtual type of visit. Now they've changed the reimbursement, so now there's this flood of additional people. Now the question is gonna be, when the pandemic's over, are those reimbursements gonna stay in place? It's the same here. The mod, it's probably compelling in terms of kind of a way to be able to reach kids, but at a district level, you still have to be mindful of the financing and not necessarily lose sight of that. So if there is flexibility and if there is a way to maybe help kind of lead in getting the state to think about it a little bit differently, I think that could be really compelling, but we just want to make sure we don't lose sight of that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to go too. I mean, traditionally, schools and a lot of courses have been lecture-based. Well, you can lecture with 100 kids in it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just as well as you can lecture with 25 kids. Or do you go, and I'm talking secondary, elementary parents listening, don't read into that too much, but, or you can go more of a project base where you have the face-to-face time with your secondary is very clear, instructional, and then focused, and then you have your distance learning portion is more where they're working on those specific projects that check the boxes on the different standards and things like that. More of the new country school model with some stronger parameters in place and more of, not, I don't want to say traditional, but I think what I'm getting at is there's some opportunities, different paths to go down, and this could change the educational model in some cases for the better.
I think we're gonna see a ton of changes, and one of them that I think about that I kinda worry about is band and choir.
Yes.
I mean, if
We talked
There,
about
we're
that
told
today.
in the church that there will be no singing in church because of the disbursement, so what's gonna happen with choir and instrument players?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably looking at large space, small
Yeah.
number of kids. When you are together with them, then a lot of it's probably distance
Yeah,
for the foreseeable future.
yeah.
I mean, they came out this weekend with additional, CDC with additional thoughts about how far the droplets
Yeah,
and whether 6 feet is enough, and this thing's gonna continue to evolve.
it is.
I think, Ryan, you said it well, we've been in this for what, 10 weeks?
I thought we were talking 68 days, because we were talking about when the school year was going to start, and we looked
Yep.
back to when the governor closed schools, and at some point this weekend, I think it was 68 days, and we're just like, there's a long time between now and the start of the year. It's more than that, right? So you
Right.
think, where are things going to be June 21st? You plan for that. Well, where's it going to be July 21st? Where's it going to be August 21st? And they can be, night and day apart.
Yeah,
So-
and we don't know, we don't know what this virus is
where
gonna do,
maximum
it's the unknown.
flexibility comes in.
Mhm.
Maximum
That's
Matt-
why I'm,
flexibility.
You just have to have maximum flexibility.
Matt, I think it would be a great capstone if you could get that online school running in 35 days.
There you go.
Be a great legacy.
we'll help you think of a name.
Right.
I'd be
Matt
happy
Helgerson
to,
online school.
come and work with your district. So Brad is on the phone.
We need a name.
Unless there's more questions about Amy's presentation of the revised fiscal 20 budget.
Connie, Tom, Sandy, anybody out there have any questions for Amy before we move on to Brad?
I was just wondering, do you think with this hybrid online school, could we take open enrollment for that?
Yep.
That would be the
Big-
goal.
That would
the
be,
goal.
that would be a big score for us then.
Yep. And I think those who do it and do it well will win.
I agree. Okay, thank you, Amy. And welcome, Brad. I hope we didn't keep you waiting too long.
No, that's fine. Can you hear me all? Can everyone hear me?
We can
Yes.
hear you very well.
Okay, good. No, I'm glad I listened, because I think it's from our perspective, we're a value-added organization. It's always good to know the situation that districts find themselves in, because it helps me kind of figure out what hearing from people firsthand what the needs are is certainly very helpful to making the case for both you and for the rest of the organization. A lot of people are in the same situations. I think that some more than others, but I guess the thing is that in your case, district is low referenda and one of the lower funded districts in the state, you don't have a lot of wiggle room in terms of fund balance, those types of things, and so most C districts find themselves in the same situation where a lot of even the freedom to do some fund balance transfers from one fund to another. If you don't have fund balances in those funds, it certainly doesn't give you. It's an advantage, but it's not as big an advantage as it is in districts that have higher levels of general ed fund balances and then bigger fund balances in other funds as well. I think that going forward, just to talk a little bit about what happened to the legislature, really the only thing that they've done is the education funding bill really just basically endorsed what the governor had done during his executive orders, and so basically the legislature has looked at those executive orders and has given its I wouldn't say blessing, but it certainly has given made them at least the force of law and chapter law for the year ahead, and I think it's something that it would there's as we're seeing both at the state and national levels. The growing amount of tension between executive branch and legislative branches in Minnesota, in other states, and also then at the federal government as well. There's just that tension is there, and so it's one of those things. It's a civics exercise that we surely didn't want to learn the way we're learning it. as it stands right now, I think the governor has to go back to continue in this. He was able during the legislative session to extend the peacetime emergency, but now that the legislature's adjourned, I think the powers of the tenure of the peacetime emergency goes till June 12th. And it sounds as though they will be reconvening on June 12th. There's a few things that are on the docket. The first and foremost is the bonding bill that didn't get passed, and they've come up with a number. I think that there was an interesting thing there's tension between, I wouldn't say tension, but I think that the Senate Republicans were hoping the House Republicans would have at least not been so ardent in their pushing back on the bonding bill, that they felt they could get something done during the end of the session without having, because you have to have, it's not just a simple majority to get the bonding bill passed, you have to have 60%. And so you need to have, in both the House and Senate, you need voters from the minority party to support your position on the bonding bill to get that done. And again, they've come up with a number on that, we don't know what the projects actually are there, but I think that that's something that they certainly do want to do, especially given we just don't know what the economy is going to look like coming out of the pandemic. And having those construction jobs, it takes a couple years for them to get in place, but I think that having, with low interest rates now and having a good-sized bonding bill, there's be the promise of jobs moving down the line, construction jobs throughout the state on these projects. The one casualty of the session, they did not get the education policy bill done. The education policy bill was very, very skinny this year. There were a couple provisions that we had worked on that we were hopeful to get, and that was allowing the functional behavior assessment to be a standalone as opposed to part of a comprehensive assessment for special ed students, and then also being able to serve kids with an IEP in an unrelated area in the ADSYS program. And I don't know if you're working an ADSYS program locally, or if you're working through a consortium that's always helpful, because you're going to find some kids that currently cannot get the instructional services through the ADSYS program that would benefit from it, but because they have a speech language IEP, and because they have a speech language IEP, they can't get the reading instruction to the ADSYS program. So oftentimes they sometimes end up then having both the speech language IEP and a specific learning disability IEP, and that's again more paperwork and more meetings, all those types of things that really drain on staff time. Going forward, I think, I heard the word shift in your discussion, and I think one of the things is they did pass the forecast articles, and so at this point in time, you can plan on, again, as someone had said in the discussion, is how many kids are going to show up is going to be determinant, but the foundation amount and the other programs have not been touched. So the dollars that they did appropriate last year, or were slated to be appropriate last year, are going to be distributed, starting July 1st. But again, a lot's going to determine, and I think as we come out of this pandemic, and I think we don't know what many parents are going to, how comfortable they're going to be, and I mean, you read the polls and you see various parts of the state, and some people are more cautious than others, but I think that you're going to see some changes in attendance patterns, and how that plays out is anyone's guess at this point, and that is something I think the legislature is going to have to look at. Again, having been around this business as long as I have, I go back to the late 1970s rather, when there was recessions, and during the late Carter years, there was recessions, and there was a string of special sessions back then, and many there was no budget reserve back then, and those types of tools were not in place for the state. So it's just very. There are some safeguards that are going to, probably keep things on track a little bit more, with a little more certainty than they were. But I think this is the second time this has really kind of happened in a decade. And again, depending on what economist you listen to, it's either going to be a V-shaped recovery, or else it's going to be. The more pessimistic folks are like, well, this could last for 5 years. I think that we're probably in somewhere in between on those things, and so we'll just have to see again, where it goes. I mean, think back, for those of you who were either on the school board or in the administration, back to 2011 session, when there was the state shutdown, and there was back then they did the funding shift, or the state aid shift. I think they drove it all the way back up to 40%, and they bought it back over time as the economy picked up. I think one of the things that they will talk about next session is shifting to some extent. Again, we'll have to see what, and again, as that calls for short-term borrowing and cash flow issues for local districts. And I think one of the things we're talk about with all of our members is that shifts are bad, but are they preferred to basically cuts in the base? And I think that's where everybody has to, it's going to be different in every district, but we want to make sure we poll folks as to what those preferences are. One of the big things that's I've talked about this with a lot of folks when they went back to the 90-10. That was never really adjusted when the state took over the general education levy back in 2001. And because of that, then there was about an extra $800 million that the state was kind of absorbing into that 90-10. And so that's just, it's a bigger amount of money than it was, back in the, prior to that. And so the shift, you save more when you do shift, but it costs the state more when they go back to 90-10. So it's one of those things I think that the department and other folks are going to have to, figure out where they come when they come with their proposals. What happened in 2011, they did increase, even with the $6 billion deficit, they increased the formula $50 each year, I believe, but that was basically to help districts pay for the short-term borrowing. And I think that's, you have to ask yourself, would you rather have 0 and 0 and no short-term borrowing, or would you rather have 50 and the short-term borrowing? And I think finding that balance is going to be one of the real challenges that the state has moving into what's probably going to be some pretty rocky territory. And again, a lot of this, this is always the problem with budget forecasting, is that and this was always the warning, even when it was a $1.5 billion surplus, that's a forecasted surplus. And again, it's kind of a bitter way to learn the lesson. But, when things change, they change dramatically, and they change very fast. And we're looking at now a deficit of over $2.5 billion. And we've gone about, almost $4 billion in the other direction. And then you add to that, probably it's going to look a little bit worse for next biennium, and how they use the cash flow count and the budget reserve and those types of things are going to be, how that plays out is going to be a lot of decisions, and I'm sure it'll be hotly debated between the legislature and the governor as to how that looks. And of course, there's an election in between with this at all as well, and how that case is made in terms of the national scene, and then how that trickles into Minnesota, and what that means in various parts of Minnesota as we saw. We see many parts of Minnesota becoming going one party, and other parts of Minnesota going the other party. And I think that it doesn't make life to come up with kind of some policies that kind of meet the needs of the whole state have become extremely difficult. And always the thing I always laud boards, and I laud the discussions you're having tonight, but you guys have to make a decision at the end of the day. You have to get kids in school, you have to, provide special ed services, you have to get kids on buses and get them to school. You have to do all those things. And so you just can't, you can't kick the can down the road. And I think that the legislature, I'm not going to say that the legislature does kick the can down the road, but they certainly, it would be nice if we could come to some, more universal solutions to many of these problems. And, that starts with a stronger general ed, starts with, greater fairness in the property tax system and a lot of other things. One of the things that, what I've heard about the federal what the state plans to do with the federal government money, a lot of it's they're talking about access to technology, and I know that, and I don't know what it's like in Jordan, but I know that a lot of it gets to be the lack of income to pay for the services, but then also lack of available technology for students. But in some cases, you don't get too far outside the metropolitan area in, you just don't have the access to the broadband, or the satellite or whatever the case might be. And oftentimes in these communities, the school is the place where the actual school building is wired. But you get into a township or you get outside the city, and in many cases inside the city, coverage can be very, very spotty. And then how do you get those children that don't have access, consistent access to broadband? How do you get them? Them up to speed and be able to, fully participate in what you're doing? And I can't see who made the comment, but talking about being able to buy the technology, as we've seen nationally, and talking to the lobbyists from Minneapolis, same thing is that, like, where you get into the queue, it's kind of like with the face masks and the ventilators and everything else. It's like it's just the market all of a sudden exploded, and you just don't know where you are in the line to get the kind of services you need, and so you've got to kind of find that sweet spot to get to where you need to get to.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about that? So the way I read the legislation, it gives school districts, and tell me if I'm reading it wrong, but it gives school districts the ability to use all of our reserved accounts, such as our LTFM, if we have dollars there to make that purchase, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that's, unless we get, now here's another question for you, and maybe you don't know. So let's just say we do that in the immediate future, we use the LTFM dollars to make that purchase, and then apply for the CARES grant whenever that comes out, whatever that looks like. My concern is, will they say, well, that's not an eligible purchase because you already purchased it? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I think that's, that there's going to be tension between the feds and the state. I've wrangled in my work with special ed. I've wrangled with the feds plenty, and one of the things there that you would hope that you would be able to borrow money from your LTFM and put it back later with CARES money. And again, I don't know if that's something that the state will allow, but I think that that's something we'll really have to pursue. Is that always the thing, the LTFM dollars were, that was a very, very it was a good thing. It was very much a bitter fight for years and years and years, especially for districts that get in that position where they're figuring out whether they should build or whether they should repair. And that's, the LTFM really kind of helped sand down some rough edges on those decisions. But yeah, what we're hearing, what I read it the same way that you do, is that you can use dollars. I mean, you can move from any place there's a surplus into a place where there's a deficit, and that's going to help. One of the real frustrations I've had though, and is I have not heard enough, I don't think, from the. I haven't heard really enough kind of attention paid to the Fund 4 deficits that everybody's running up, and everybody's running up those Fund 4 deficits on the child care and also on the food service. People are just running up those deficits, and not having the state is talking about a lot of, they've got kind of 4 things that they're talking about, but none of them really look at that, those existing deficits that are really going to need to be addressed moving into the future. I think that, and again, that's really unfortunate, because I think it's something that's being universally experienced. And it seems that one of the things, and again, this could be just my impression, but listening to people talk about the CARES dollars, they're talking about specific things as opposed to general things. You're not a district that gets a lot of Title I money. You'll have some flexibility. I'm talking more about not the money you'll be getting directly to you, distributed through Title I. That will be money that you can use anywhere. At least that's the way that I read that. It's the money that the state holds back from that. They hold $14 million, and then there's another $43 million that will go partially to K-12 and partially to the higher education. I think they're talking in the low $40 million range for those dollars, or something around that amount, that will go to K-12, and they're talking about more specific things. One of the things they're talking about a lot is the student support services that that may be necessary as we try to transition back to regular school. As to how are many kids going to be able to anxiety will be high in some cases, and finding the staff necessary or getting staff out there to augment, or programs out there to augment, those challenges. I think is something they're talking about quite a bit as well.
We have to end, Brad, now, but I just want to thank you for being with us tonight. But I have one thing, and maybe a board member or two has something also to add. But one thing that I would just, I think you're right. Flexibility, I think Rob said it, flexibility is going to be key during this. Flexibility and being able to use funds. So what we've done in our district is hold back on those LTFM projects, hoping that would be a funding source, because we don't have a whole lot of funds to transfer from elsewhere. But you just said it. I think you were going down this path. We actually discussed it today. We have RTI, and we have title staff members. If we can take some of those specialists and reallocate them to reducing class sizes for our elementary, that's going to be, I think that's going to be key, because you think about, let's just say that the ratio MDH allows is 15-1. Who has that staffing? So what we've been talking about is shifting our secondary to more of that hybrid model, and our elementary kids come every day, and using some of our middle school instructors to teach elementary. But another way to solve it is by having your RTI instructors, your title instructors become classroom teachers as well. The concern that was brought up as well, there's a specific funding stream, and there's specific purposes for that. So getting to my point, advocate to allow us to do what we feel is best in our district, that flexibility in spending, but also that flexibility in terms of how how things have to be coded, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think, that's going to be a challenge. I mean, what they've done this year is that, the governor's orders have, I think, given that flexibility for the remainder of this year.
Yeah.
But in talking to the folks at the Department of Ed, because your special ed staff, your special ed paras, you can continue to code them as special ed, even though they might have been providing child care or helping deliver meals, whatever the case was. They could still be coded as special ed. And that was to keep the special ed dollars, keep that, keep that special ed base where it needs to be moving forward. Because, again, for maintenance of efforts purposes and for I can't believe the federal government's just not going to look at maintenance of effort and say that doesn't really matter because of the what we've gone through. But I think that yeah, you're right. I mean, the thing is now is just to say how can each local district best serve and do it within, oftentimes keeping current staff in, but reassigning current staff to do something a little bit different that in the end could be, provide as much or maybe more benefit. As one of the board members was talking about as I was listening, things are likely going to look different. It's like this. Sometimes you come out of a crisis and things look remarkably the same. But I think in this crisis, this time, just the way that the world's been working and a lot of the changes in technology are showing that there are some different ways to approach this, and there's going to be a lot of trial and error. But I think that it's going to be people are going to really start understanding that the box is a lot bigger than they thought it was, and there's some creative ways to use existing staff, and instead of being bound by a lot of the kind of tight procedural rules that kind of state and federal governments always want to do. Trust the locals to say, here are the standards. Get those kids to the standards.
Yeah.
And here, use your staff in the best way to do that. And I think that this might be the opportunity. We may finally start seeing that again, where we're going to get away from a rule-bound way of looking at the world to something more schools for learning and schools for getting kids to certain outcomes, and getting them there is going to be up to the locals to figure it out.
Well, thank you, Brad. And my parting shot would be, I think somebody needs to sit down with the Department of Ed and explain to them how school funding works, because I don't think they get it.
Well, they are still working. It's kind of amazing. They're still working on their funding study, and I think, I feel bad for Tom Melcher, because every time they have a funding study, the state goes broke. And he doesn't have the money to be able to do some of the things that he's wanted to do, and now he's retiring. And I think this was kind of his last go-around, and again, going from a kind of an advantageous position of having dollars to kind of, what I call it, sandpaper, to kind of, every time there's a formula change, there's going to be some rough spots, and to have that sandpaper to just kind of throw around to, smooth out those rough spots. That's not going to be there. But I think, again, as they move that study, and I think that just, talking to the commissioner, just to get folks, thinking more and more about, maybe this is the opportunity to really make, they've talked about the innovation zone language for years and years, just to really kind of take the halter off the districts and kind of let them run and let them do what they do best.
Great. Well, thank you, Brad. Any board members have any comments or questions? We appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. And again, never hesitate. We're going to be having some regional meetings next week, and I think Deb Griffiths has sent that out. We're trying to make, we usually, and we want to make that available to everybody. A lot of times, only folks can go, but I guess that's one of the advantages we've seen with the technology, is that you can get 50, 60 people in a meeting, and you can have, we're having 3 meetings next week where we're going to get a wider swath of members. So if anybody wants to just join in, I'll make sure that I think Matt probably has the information, and just, get it out to everybody on the board, and can see what's going on in other districts as well.
Will do.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Brad.
Yeah, bye.
Okay, I think we'll take like a 3-minute break.
Before you do,
Yes,
Connie and Sandy, you guys will get a separate.
Tom.
And Tom, I'm sorry. You guys will get a separate email from, Hope with a new login information, okay? So it's just gonna be the three of you.
For right now or for when?
for right now, yeah.
Okay.
So
Yep.
Oh,
we'll,
okay.
we'll reconvene in about 3-4 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you.
So we should leave the meeting then, and then come back under the new invite. Is that what you're saying?
Yep,
Yes.
exactly.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all for being with us tonight. Have a good rest of the week.
So this is just board then?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just board and then Hope will stay because she's got to disconnect everything.
Very cool. Well, lucky you, lucky us.